during the day, they labored with their nets on the Sea of Galilee and began setting aside funds to support their future work. At night, they studied with Jesus at the synagogue library, where he taught them about the kingdom and illuminated their understanding of the Hebrew Scriptures. He intended to spread his message by building upon concepts already present in the minds of his listeners.
On June 12th, AD 26, just a few short months after the baptism, word came that John had been arrested by Herod Antipas. He was being held at Herod's fortress at Machaerus in southern Perea. He'd been cast into a dungeon where he would spend the remaining 18 months of his life. Jesus swung into action, and on the Sabbath of the following week delivered his first public address in the Capernaum synagogue. He laid out the fundamentals of the kingdom of heaven, accessible here and now through the exercise of simple faith. By August, Jesus felt the apostles were ready to begin their experience of taking his message to the people. During the following 5 months, they visited major towns in Galilee and made initial contact with the Gentiles in the Decapolis, the cities of Hippos, Gadara, Abila, and Gerasa. During this time, increasing numbers of people had been coming to see Jesus. Word about him had spread far from the Sea of Galilee. Inquirers had come from cities as far away as Tyre, Sidon, Caesarea, Damascus, and Jerusalem. Initially, Jesus had greeted these people and taught them concerning the kingdom, but the Master gradually turned this work over to the 12. Andrew would select one of the apostles and assign him to a group of visitors, and sometimes all 12 of them were so engaged. On Sunday, January 12th, AD 27, in the hills above Capernaum, overlooking the Sea of Galilee, Jesus ordained the 12 as ambassadors of the kingdom in what would become known as the Sermon on the Mount. He charged them with going into the world to begin the task of orienting people to the adventure of progressive citizenship in a spiritual universe. Capernaum was not far from Tiberias. Jesus knew that Herod would soon begin to take notice of his work, so he decided to focus his efforts on Judea and Perea, a region containing many believers in John's teachings. There was considerable tension between the followers of John and those of Jesus. Why didn't Jesus use his power to free John from prison? Why didn't the followers of Jesus baptize new believers? Why didn't Jesus teach fasting and self-denial? Through tactful and patient personal effort, Jesus and the 12 spent most of AD 27 quietly taking over John's work. And John, from prison, encouraged his followers to give full allegiance to Jesus. By April, Jesus and the 12 had made their way down the Jordan Valley to the vicinity of Jerusalem. They spent the entire month talking with people attending Passover, many of whom hailed from distant provinces of the Roman Empire. This was the real beginning of public preaching. Jesus or one of the apostles taught daily in the temple. Jesus taught one single precept: love the Lord your God with all your mind and soul, and your neighbor as yourself. And he taught this in place of the 613 rules of living expounded by the Pharisees. When the crowds grew too great to find entrance into the temple teaching, the apostles taught outside the sacred precincts. It was their first contact with such enormous crowds, and they learned many valuable lessons which proved of great assistance in their later work. The most radical element of Jesus' teaching was his insistence that there was nothing man needed to do to win God's love beyond the exercise of faith. He taught about a kingdom accessible right here and now, a world of creative personal relationships between God, ourselves, and each other. By the end of April, the opposition of the religious leaders and temple rulers had become so disruptive that Jesus left Jerusalem with the 12 and went south into Judea. They may have walked this very road which dates from Roman times. They did no public preaching, but went from house to house, talking with people about the kingdom. And this was a pattern that came to characterize much of their work. They would work in a particular area until the interference of the religious authorities became too distracting. Then they would revert to personal ministry until the situation stabilized. Then, once again, they would initiate a period of aggressive public teaching.
In Judea today, sheep and goats are still grazed in the hills. Herds of camels roam the desert. Ibex dominate the canyon walls in the Dead Sea region. Olive trees may be found that have nourished people for hundreds of years. Farther to the south, Judea extends into the Negev desert. Here we find Kerioth, the birthplace of Judas Iscariot, the only Judean in the apostolic group. A short distance from Kerioth lie the ruins of the ancient city of Arad, which contain the oldest Yahweh sanctuary yet discovered. Its altar for burnt offerings is constructed around a large, uncut stone. Close by is the Holy of Holies, containing 2 standing stones, one for Yahweh and one for Asherah, his divine feminine consort. Perhaps a faint echo of the ancient Mesopotamian stories of a divine couple who came to earth to teach humankind the arts of civilization.
This month, Jesus left the apostles to work in Judea, crossing the desert to En-Gedi with Abner. The walk from Hebron to En-Gedi is almost 15 miles, with a 4,360-foot elevation change. Jesus wanted to spend some time with the followers of John, who congregated at the oasis. Abner was the chief of John's disciples and the acknowledged head of the Nazarite colony at En-Gedi. The tension between the leaders of John's disciples and the apostles of Jesus grew worse with the increasing number of believers in Jesus' teachings. Integrating his message with John's and fostering productive relationships between the two groups were perhaps the biggest challenges facing Jesus during his early ministry. In June, they returned to Jerusalem. They did no public preaching. They set up camp among the olive trees in Gethsemane and engaged in personal work. But by the end of the month, opposition had grown once again, and Jesus decided to take the apostles north into Samaria. Here was Jacob's well, where Jesus met the Samaritan woman, and to her made the first direct pronouncement of his divine nature. He told her about the living water, the water which would quench the thirsting of the soul. The enthusiastic reception of the Samaritans greatly encouraged the apostles in their work. It also helped them overcome their strong cultural prejudices against the Samaritans. On the slopes of Mount Gerizim, they set up camp. They taught in the Samaritan cities each day. In the evenings, they would gather at camp, where Jesus would continue to instruct them in the ways of the kingdom. The Samaritans believed Yahweh had designated Mount Gerizim as the location for the temple, not Jerusalem. The Samaritans had worshipped in a temple here for hundreds of years, a temple which had been destroyed by the Hasmoneans in the previous century. In later years following the resurrection, the Apostle Philip taught on this site. But the religious authorities were becoming more aggressive and relentless in their harassment of Jesus. Herod Antipas was in a turmoil, afraid to release John and afraid to execute him. Accordingly, Jesus took the apostles south to a secluded area of Mount Gilboa. He wanted more time to teach and train them, and perhaps do some quiet work in the nearby cities of the Decapolis. He was reluctant to undertake any further public work until John either should be executed or freed to join them in a united effort. Mount Gilboa was in the territory of the Decapolis,